This playlist pulls together the components of the lecture that covers the social contract theory chapter in Rachel's, but it also focuses slightly more on specifics related to Thomas Hobbes and his book Leviathan. In the lecture, I'll deviate fairly significantly at times from the narrative that you find in Rachel's chapter. I'll focus on different things, adding, for instance, a little bit about the historical times of Hobbes, widening the scope of our understanding of what Hobbes was trying to do in his theory a little bit. But all basic elements of Rachel's chapter will be reiterated in this lecture. So I'm going to start off by talking about Thomas Hobbes himself and the tumultuous times that shaped him. And then I'll give us some insight into the sort of life that led Hobbes to the sorts of views that he would advocate. And as we'll see, the sort of combination of different elements in Hobbes's thinking, they're not what we normally associate with one or another political view contemporaneously. So we'll want to pay attention to that. Now, Hobbes is probably the first contractarian, and contractarians hold that legal and moral authority arises out of an implicit contract that all members of any given society have agreed to, and that this contract is shaped by rational truths that can be derived by understanding two specific elements. On the one hand, contractarians talk about the initial condition. Now, the initial condition is sometimes viewed historically, and as we'll see, that's certainly one way that people try to criticize Hobbes. But it can also be viewed as a hypothetical. What would the world be like if people didn't listen to reason in acting and interacting with one another? And then, of course, a characterization of rational agency. What drives individual people? What dictates reason brings to the forefront upon rational reflection about the nature of human nature and of the world? And these two things will help to shape the parameters under which any social contract can be formulated. We'll look specifically at Hobbes's notion of what it is to be a rational agent. So Hobbes is interesting and important in a number of ways, but one way is that he actually had a sort of very mechanistic and naturalistic view about human beings and how they operate. So he thought about all human action largely as a deterministic result of aversions and desires. And so he characterizes certain aversions and desires that he thinks drive human beings in the same way that forces drive physical objects. He thinks that all human beings are essentially rational egoists, and that no human being has a significant advantage over other human beings, even if in the short term they have some advantage over another. Say, I'm taller than you, or I'm smarter than you, or I happen to have a gun and you don't. But over the long term, Hobbes thinks that no individual can remain dominant over a long period of time because other individuals could collaborate to overthrow them. And so for Hobbes, people are roughly equal, and it's a rational truth about humanity. And finally, Hobbes thinks that there are really three sorts of drives or motives, situations that give rise to conflict among people. The first is competition. Competition over resources, competition over all sorts of things that human beings desire. Diffidence, right? So very limited ability to empathize or act altruistically towards others. And that actually for Hobbes manifests itself a lot in terms of a sort of favoritism for the people that you know and are close to and related to. And finally, a desire for glory, a recognition of your own worth. When we turn to the initial condition, Hobbes paints a pretty stark picture. For Hobbes, the world is a place of relative scarcity. It's not a world where everyone can have enough to satisfy them. And when you combine that with the properties of the individual agents within that state of nature, it yields what Hobbes called, within that initial condition rather, it yields what Hobbes called the state of nature, which is his characterization of what the world would be like if agents pursued items that are in relative scarcity without constraining themselves through rational reflection. However, because human beings are rational agents, they can engage in rational reflection, and Hobbes thinks that this results in the recognition of certain natural rights and natural laws. And these natural rights and natural laws, they both articulate the sorts of freedoms and limitations of freedoms that people have, and also the things that reason commands them to do, even against their own sort of rational, egoistic impulses. So we'll look at the first natural right, which for Hobbes is the right of self-preservation. Then we'll look at the first natural law, which for Hobbes is the law to seek peace whenever possible. And then the second natural law, which is to seek contracts, that is, to seek peace through entering into social contracts with people. And again, these contracts don't need to be explicit. For Hobbes, it's pretty much an implicit contract, the social contract. But contracts always involve individuals sacrificing something for some benefit. And as a result, usually what we see when we talk about the social contract is a sacrifice of a certain degree of our natural rights, our freedom to do or not do something, in order to secure something, namely greater peace, harmony, continuity through social order. And this will give us insight into Hobbes's vision of the best society. So we'll talk a little bit about how Hobbes understands how society would best be structured and run. And then we'll look at the two objections to social contract theory that Rachel raises towards the end of his chapter. We'll talk about whether or not the state of nature is plausibly real or definitely fictional and what the implications of that might be. And then we'll talk about the limitations of the idea of social contract. When we think about social contract as the primary means of extending rights and obligations, because contracts are only the sorts of things that only rational agents can engage in, and that seems to rule out a number of different classes or groups that don't seem capable of engaging in those kinds of contracts. So in the next section, we'll start talking about that first little bit about Hobbes, his legacy, the times that shaped him, and so on.